So the NATO summit has just wrapped up in Ankara, and it's going to be one of the most pivotal in some ways. This is not one dramatic moment. It is a series of structural shifts, systemic changes over 2 days of announcements, conversations, and that are all coming together to see significant changes in the balance of power, not only between Russia and Ukraine, but of course between Europe, the United States, and the overall dynamics of the globe. And here's what makes that, of course, remarkable, that it always comes down to one largely individual. The same man who told Zelensky 18 months ago that Ukraine had no cards is that man now sitting next to Zelensky saying that, well, actually, you may well be able to use our Patriots, something that Russia has spent years desperately trying to prevent Ukraine from getting, and something that fundamentally changes the long-term military equation of this war. And that was just one moment, because alongside it came this 2-year financial commitment that dwarfs anything that Russia can match, a formal recognition of Ukraine's new status in NATO, unthinkable even 6 months ago, and deals that are integrating Ukraine's defense industry into NATO in ways that cannot easily be undone. So in this video, I want to walk you through what has happened after the second day at the NATO summit, what it means for the war in Ukraine, what it means for Russia's calculus, or Putin specifically, and of course, where it all is going to go for the rest of this year and further. Let's get into it.
This is the Global Gambit.
Hey guys, welcome back to this sort of quick roundup of the second day. A couple of highlights I noticed from the NATO summit. Tomorrow I will be speaking with General Ben Hodges, a regular on the program, as well as a couple of other NATO experts over the weekend, and later on Preston Stewart, a fellow YouTuber and returning guest who was actually on the ground. So if those are themes, people that you are interested to hear from, if you find this kind of content interesting, then of course do subscribe so you don't miss it. But here is what I thought was worth taking note of. Now, to understand, of course, why this week is so important, you have to understand where things stood going into Ankara. 18 months ago, we had Trump sitting across Zelensky in the Oval Office and telling him he had no cards. The theatrical absolute disaster, which was the engagement, for lack of a better word, in the White House, and the deplorable behavior of the United States administration in the face of a man who's leading a country on the receiving end of one of the worst wars in living memory, or the largest in Europe since the Second World War. Indeed, Trump said Ukraine couldn't win. The relationship between Washington and Kiev was at its lowest since the full-scale invasion. American military aid was then stopped, and Trump was pursuing what looked like a negotiated settlement with the Russians, with Putin on the side, completely negating Ukraine, let alone Europe. But now, this week, Trump sits next to Zelensky and says, on the record, because the contrast is extraordinary, that, well, we are ready to give you access to understanding how to leverage and utilize to construct the most important military piece of equipment that the Ukrainians have been asking for, the Patriot missiles. Trump effectively said that he thinks we've developed a very good relationship. It's going to be the beginning, and you know, the country has a lot of future. Some diplomats at NATO said that Trump likes winners, and Ukraine has been winning much more relative to Russia. Therefore, it's quite simple that Trump is deciding to switch sides, regardless of where he stood those months before. He has no loyalty, we know this about him. He just wants what's best for not even the United States, just for himself. And if he can back Ukraine, which will ultimately give him a greater respect amongst the American electorate, especially up to the midterms, he's going to do that. And well, is that a worst case scenario, or we prefer it to be in a better way, that he actually cares about the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and vis-a-vis Europe for its own sake? Yes. But if this is the best that we can get, well, then perhaps we just have to play ball. And a lot of playing ball is exactly what the NATO summit, in my eyes and some others, was all about. Placating Trump, finding ways to appease him, keep him on the good side in the longer term. Perhaps not even hosting a summit next year for fear of what his mood may be like when and if, most likely when, he's decimated in the midterms. Simply, Trump, whatever you say about him, responds to momentum, and Ukraine has that momentum. And Ankara's summit showed what means when the most powerful country in the world decides to get behind you. Simply put, let me start with this significant announcement of the Patriots, because it kind of came out of nowhere, although Zelensky had been pushing for it very hard. When Trump and Zelensky met on the sidelines, Trump floated the possibility of granting this license to manufacture the Patriots. Now, the Patriot is the most advanced air defense system in the world. A complete battery costs more than $1 billion. A single interceptor missile costs up to $4 million. Only 600 are produced globally each year. And until this week, only 2 countries in the entire world had ever been granted a license to co-produce Patriots domestically: Japan and Germany. Kind of ironic, historically. Now, Ukraine has been asking this for years, and the reason it matters so urgently right now is visible in this week's casualty figures. Russia is firing up to 100 ballistic missiles at Ukraine every month. Ukraine can shoot down, say, 90% of the drones or cruise missiles, but ballistic missiles are different. They leave the atmosphere, they plunge back at speed, and 2/3 of them are currently getting through. 59 people have been killed in Kiev in just the past week, 31 in one strike on Thursday, and 28 on Monday. Ukraine's military said on Wednesday it failed to shoot down a single ballistic missile overnight, partially because of shortages and concerns of that nature, not because of the lack of skill. A license to therefore manufacture Patriots doesn't solve the problem, but production is certainly a few months away. But it certainly gives the growing reassurance and, of course, the morale bridge. If formally granted, it changes the long-term equation entirely, meaning Ukraine could eventually produce enough interceptors for its own needs and those of its allies. It means the weapon Russia has most desperately tried to prevent Ukraine from having becomes something Ukraine can manufacture at will, and therefore Ukraine even becomes a bit of a guardian for surrounding nation states, as we've seen with those incursions into the Baltics or Romanian airspace in the past few months. Unsurprisingly, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, immediately reacted, downplaying it as ambivalent and not a major shift. But the speed and specificity of that response tells you exactly how much Russia has been watching the NATO alliance, and this announcement especially. Now, the Patriot announcement got the headlines, but it sits within the broader package that is equally significant and that I touched on in my video yesterday, so go and watch that one after this. NATO's allies have formally committed $70 billion in military assistance to Ukraine by the end of 2026, and to match or exceed that in 2027. This is a 2-year commitment, locked in, institutionalized in the summit declaration. For context, this comes on top of the $90 billion Europe agreed in December, and includes $30 billion the UN began providing in its support loan programs this year, with another $30 million earmarked for 2027. Now, this is a lot of numbers, but simply Germany alone, for context, has committed more than $11 billion in military support this year. And the US is not part of this commitment, note. But Trump has halted direct military donations. But again, it demonstrates that Europe doesn't really need the United States to provide that financial support. It's the military know-how and the materialistic elements like the Patriot that still make the United States the distinguishing factor here. And critically, Zelensky left Ankara as something that goes beyond money. He left with that Ukraine formally being recognized as a contributor, no longer a recipient. Now that, you may well say, well, it's just a status change, but it reflects Ukraine's advances in drone warfare, its battlefield innovation, its rapidly expanding defense industry. And on the first day of the summit, Ukraine signed new deals with Estonia, the Netherlands, Denmark to share this cutting-edge expertise in drone warfare in exchange for things like royalties, military hardware and investment. Ukraine is not just receiving Western technology, it's exporting and pioneering its own. Now, I want to address the elephant in the room, or as I call him, the orangutan, which of course I'm aware. Orangutans are incredibly intelligent and sentient creatures, unlike the one in the White House. Simply that this summit produced a Trump who threatened to remove all US soldiers from Europe, reiterated his demand that Denmark hand over Greenland, called Spain a terrible partner and hopelessly bad people, blasted Britain, Germany, Italy for not supporting the war with Iran, and declared the Iran ceasefire over. Of course, I will be covering that as well. But this is the context in which the warm words for Ukraine landed. When European leaders who have spent 18 months learning how to manage Trump read it clearly. The threats and the bombast are the price of admission. The substance underneath the noise was more positive for Ukraine than at any point since Trump has returned to office. One person who I spoke to at the summit, who was also actually listening to Trump firsthand, said he was actually decent and quite serious in the internal meetings. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance, what we see with the cameras, but of course there's a huge table round and you sit there with an earpiece and you listen to the various perspectives in the different languages, and apparently Trump was quite intently listening on certain areas. Whether he understood it is a different matter, but the point is that Trump was a lot more constructive in his manners, at least where we hopefully it matters not just in words, but actually through action. For instance, Secretary of State Rubio said that Ukraine's deep strike campaign could open a window of opportunity for ending this war. And Trump himself, speaking about Putin, said he didn't think that the Russian leader was thrilled with what's happening and that his conditions for ending the war were changing. Now, that's not the language of a US president who thinks Russia is winning. That is the language of a US president who's looked at the battlefield picture and concluded that Ukraine has the momentum, and therefore it's more beneficial for him to be on Team Ukraine. Now, let's look at the Russian side quickly. Putin sent Peskov to Ankara to monitor the summit and issue deflections. The Patriot license was ambivalent, NATO statements were confrontational, constructive, and Russia will press on with its objectives regardless of what is happening with the weapons Ukraine receives or the diplomatic flurries, as Peskov has called them. But look at what Russia is actually facing as a result of this week. Ukraine is getting a license to manufacture the one weapon system Russia has most desperately tried to prevent it from having. The alliance just locked in 2 years of financial guarantees at a level that dwarfs anything Russia can ever match. Ukraine's defense industry is being integrated into NATO's industrial base with drone deals signed across multiple allied countries. And even the US president, who Putin spent years cultivating as a potential ally, is now sitting next to Zelensky, calling him a winner and saying Ukraine has a lot of future. So Putin's two core strategic bets, that Western support will fracture and that Ukraine can't sustain the military pressure, are both failing simultaneously and incredibly. The coalition hasn't fractured, it looks wobbly and certainly it's not fully out of the woods yet, but this is the most positive conditions that the broader military alliance of NATO has looked for months. And the one external actor Putin needs most, i.e. Trump, has completely shifted. It's incredible how things can change overnight just because of a couple of individuals or a couple of shifts by policy. Another senior official that I spoke to said that Russia lacks the military capacity for a near-term attack on NATO territory and will be deeply concerned about the alliance's response. So this is not the assessment of an alliance that thinks it's losing the strategic competition with Moscow. This is one feeling emboldened, rejuvenated. There is a strategic clarity, an idea of what NATO stands for, what it is about, and how it can go about achieving those strategic and military objectives, not just over the short to medium term, but over the longer term. Now, of course, we'd like to be in a Europe which was more peaceful and stable, but we have to behave as the world is, not as we'd like it to be. And certainly after this 2-day summit, I'm feeling a lot more optimistic, cautiously optimistic. We have a long way to go, but certainly the growing reassurance and confidence that Europe especially, and that we like to emphasize on this channel, is showing demonstrates that there is a lot more to come, be that through the EU, but also through NATO. And of course, with Ukraine being one of the core players. And that's without even considering the growing disintegration, the decline of the Russian economy, the growing walls that are coming around Putin, closing in on him. Putin is running out of road. Never before have I seen him this paranoid. Never before have I seen him approaching the Russian elites, asking for money. Never before am I seeing him looking left, right, and so rattled by not the United States, but by Europe and increasingly Ukraine, actors that he doesn't want to treat as equals, but he has to because they are putting up the resistance and they are putting up the capacity to fight Russia on its own terms. Indeed, Putin is losing, and he is only going to continue to lose as the united front through NATO only deepens and grows, and we have that greater clarity and sense of purpose continuing. But that's it from me, everyone. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then of course do subscribe and like this one, and watch this video here if you like a deeper dive into this huge announcement that came out of the first day yesterday, as well as the upcoming interviews I have with Ben Hodges and other senators, including such as Mark Kelly, we'll be having back. We'll speak soon. Take care.